Hey everyone, Andrig with Andrig's Aircooled technology. Been promising to do a video on fan shrouds, and so this is it. And we're going to talk about mostly the late model stuff. I do have early model Volkswagen, Porsche 356 as well in the background here. Not going to really talk about them. Obviously, those are not being used mostly in terms of any real high performance stuff, although in cases they are. And I do have a new next generation lightweight cooling fan for both of them. But suffice it to say, we're not going to really cover those. We're going to cover first aftermarket 36 horsepower style fan shrouds with out heater outlets. And I've got three of those. I've got a Scat, an MP, and a CB Performance. CB Performance tells me their fan shroud has nothing in common with Scat and MP, that they have their own tooling, etc. And there is a little bit of evidence for that in that inside, I don't know if you'll really be able to see this, but where my finger is right here, this is the part of the fan shroud that is redirecting the air from the 1-2 cylinder side to the doghouse for the oil cooler, right? And there is a definite tooling issue right here where this actually sticks out a little bit. You could find, any of either my first generation or second generation fan could potentially even rub right there because it sticks out, but you could always just grind that down, smooth that out. But that is telling in terms of looking at all the things about this fan shroud and comparing them to MP and Scat. There is that little tweak there. Having said that, most everything else looks really identical. The tooling must be a little different here because of that, and I've noticed this is really true on all of them, but essentially everything else looks pretty close to the same. Now, there are some subtle differences elsewhere, but they're really minor. That's probably the biggest thing. So it does look like they've used their own tooling, although the tooling's, obviously it has to be very similar because they have to come out the same. All three of these brand fan shrouds, they're too narrow. They're actually 3 millimeters too narrow. I had to account for that actually in my fixed cooling flap designed for these things to have them in the right spot, and all of them suffer from this part being incorrect. One is too long on this side for us to actually put flaps in there. Of course, they weren't designed for flaps, so they didn't really care. Two, this part that's supposed to seal up against the oil cooler actually doesn't. It's actually not in the right proportions. And this is an OEM fan shroud, and you can actually see the difference there. I don't know if you'll be able to tell on this video, but let me just kind of show you, because they're all these aftermarket ones are the same. They have the exact same problems. It's this area here. This is too long. You see, I've got it marked for cutting. I didn't actually modify this fan shroud completely for my fixed cooling flaps, but I have another one that's fully modified. So you have to cut that back in order for that to fit. So that's too long. And this is actually too short, and it has this really, it seems like they've tried to make this longer because they have this much bigger indentation for where the oil cooler mount is, as if that's going to slide all the way in there, but it doesn't. So if you look at an OEM, this is an OEM from a 73 Beetle. And we'll look at that same spot, those same spots. Of course, I've got my fixed cooling flaps installed in this right now. You can see how different that looks, right? It's got a short thing here, but this part is actually is longer, and so it actually seals up against the oil cooler properly, so you don't get leakage of air through there. Where instead it's actually going to stay going through the oil cooler, and that's really one of the big problems with these things is, and I've seen people that do videos on how to modify these and what have you with sheet metal, and if you love to fabricate and you like to work with and you're good at working with thin sheet metal and whatever, you can fix these up and weld them and get them exactly right. Of course, you can't correct the width of them, that's just wrong. So it's slightly wrong. It's almost like instead of using millimeters, they were using inches or something like that, and converted and lost 1/8 of an inch or something. But it's bizarre why they're a little bit smaller, but they are, and it makes a difference in terms of how they fit to the tin, right? So if you have to pull in when you do that screw on the outside of the cylinder tin, and it has to pull in to the fan shroud, which they do, it distorts the rest of the metal, right? And so it actually causes the back to kind of open up a little bit, which then causes you to have to do things like, if you want it to seal well against the surface, many times you end up tapping this thing, or putting self-tapping screws in here to hold it together. So you're just kind of like warping up all the metal when you put these things together. So I'm not real pleased with the Scat, the MP, or the CB Performance, generally speaking, from that perspective. Now, do they work? Yes, they work. And if you do a few modifications, they actually work quite well. Although they all share one thing in common as well, is they got the opening size wrong. So on the OEM fan shroud, this is 148 millimeters across, diameter wise. Of course, it varies a little bit. I think I've measured up to about 148.3 on the OEM one. And when you're working with just stamped sheet metal parts like this is, and then they're spot welded together, you're going to get that kind of area. And 0.3 millimeter variation is not a big deal. But when you shrink that opening, what are you doing? You're actually creating more restriction. So all three of them suffer from that problem. They're 147 millimeters, and it's like, okay, it's 1 millimeter. Is that really going to make a difference? It makes about a little over 2% difference in airflow, just that 1 millimeter. So it actually does make a difference. So if you have one of these fan shrouds, you're going to use one of these fan shrouds. It wouldn't prevent you from using them or tell you not to use them, because they will work. I would always use these with a velocity ring, to be frank, because of the extra constriction of the smaller diameter inlet. So they're all like that. They vary a little bit from each other. I measured them all. So that was it. That was a Scat. And the interesting thing, the Scat and the MP look really identical. I couldn't find really anything that I could find different other than the Scat stamp behind here. They seem to fit exactly the same way. They have the same issue of being too narrow. They have the same issue with this part being wrong, just like the CB Performance. They definitely have the inlet obviously is the wrong size, slightly, but everything else I couldn't find anything about how they're stamped, how they're welded together with the spot welding stuff. They look really, really identical. I don't know if they're using the same, maybe MP moved to Scat's tooling, or maybe they're all using the same vendor to manufacture this, even if one of them has slightly different tooling than the others. But they definitely, this is the MP. This was a powder coated MP one, but obviously they come in black too, etc. But I couldn't really find anything different. It doesn't have that pronounced tweak right here. There is a tweak there on both the Scat and the MP, but it's just not nearly as pronounced as the CB Performance. So that could also be they're all using the same vendor, and even if CB Performance has their own tooling with that vendor that's slightly different, it could be that their tooling is wearing and whatever, and it's causing that tweak, and they need to refresh their tooling. This stuff doesn't last forever, right? The tooling doesn't last forever. I don't know how many fan shroud these guys have made of all this stuff, but generally speaking, they all suffer from the same issues, but they will work for you. Although I would recommend always, if you have a Scat, MP, or CB Performance 36 horsepower style doghouse fan shroud, or even their non-doghouse style, that's really the same fan shroud, just with the doghouse removed for the most part, early style, because they left the internals large enough to fit the later model fan. So So if you have any of those, definitely they'll work, but I would always recommend using a velocity ring with them to help with the airflow. The saving grace of these ones without heater outlets is obviously all of the air is going to cool the engine. None of them's actually running through the heater boxes. With a heater box style fan shroud, obviously a portion of the air that I'm measuring through is going out the heater channels, and actually there's always airflow flowing through those. A lot of people think, oh, I've got the heat off, well, all the air is going to cool the engine. No, that's actually not true. If you actually look at the internals of the fan shroud, I don't know if we can see it in here. There is a channel on the OEM ones that's right here, that's dedicated towards this. Air is always coming through that. I have these plugs in here because I wasn't using heater channels on the engine I was originally running this on, which is a 2110cc engine that I had in the car, that's a test car that's behind me. But I wasn't using heater boxes, so you actually should maintain airflow through here, because actually even when the heaters are closed, there's a vent on the top of your heater boxes that vents air. So air is always flowing, a portion of the air from the fan shroud is always flowing through there to actually keep that from just getting so hot that it actually starts baking the cylinder heads, right? Because they run underneath the cylinder head rocker box. You don't want that, right? So there's always air flowing through there and venting out the top of the heater box. When you actually do your controls in the car, whether it's the twist style on the early cars or the lever style on the later cars, and you open up that, obviously it opens a flap external out there. When that flap gets opened, it closes off the vent, so that air is not flowing out the vent and not flowing into the car. So that's the way those things work. It's pretty straightforward. So if you have a heater box if you have heater boxes, I would never recommend using those 36 horsepower style ones with their heater box style, because they didn't do anything to cordon off part of the air. There's no additional width of the fan shroud. It's the same. All they did is cut a hole in the thing and stick an adapter on it. So essentially, you're just bleeding air from cooling your cylinder. Now, if it's cold weather, it may not hurt you that much, but they don't flow proper air really. They weren't designed for it. So it's just kind of like pressure in the fan shroud forces air to come out that way. And not really the greatest thing. If you want heater boxes, either have an OEM fan shroud that has these, or there's one additional aftermarket fan shroud that I'm going to talk about